My name's Emily Brown, and I'm a master's student at the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries, and I'm going to be introducing our speaker today. I'm very pleased to be introducing our presenter today, Dr. Jessica Gephart. Dr. Gephart is an assistant professor in environmental science at American University. She received her PhD in environmental science from the University of Virginia and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. Her research focuses on how seafood globalization and environmental change interconnect, and she evaluates how seafood trade drives distant environmental impacts, as well as how environmental shocks disrupt seafood trade. Her work brings together global trade data, local consumption data, and environmental impact data to understand the opportunities and risks of seafood globalization for sustainable production and food security. She served on the scientific leadership team for the Blue Food Assessment, where she co-led the environmental and justice chapters and currently serves as a U.S. Science Envoy for the U.S. Department of State. Welcome, Dr. Gephart.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you all for being here. Go ahead and start sharing my slides. Excellent. Well, thank you all for having me today. I'm going to be talking today about some of my recent and current sort of ongoing work related to blue food trade. And by blue foods, I mean all aquatic foods, whether they're farmed or wild and whether they're inland or marine. Some of these results are preliminary, but they're in a pretty close to finalized position for being submitted. So you're among some of the first people to be seeing some of these insights about global blue food trade. The presentation is going to be centered around the motivation for looking at blue food trade in order as a focus of working toward more sustainable food systems. So I'll start off with talking about some of the background and motivation for this work. I'll move on to a brief overview of the estimates and methods for blue food trade disaggregation. And then I will move toward some of the main findings of the overall patterns in global blue food trade, starting with some of the major trends, some of the shifts in trade flows, then moving toward consumption patterns and the diversity of consumption within different countries around the world. And finally, I'll close with some key messages and some of the future ongoing projects and applications of this work. So to start, the focus on blue foods for me comes from the motivation of understanding the potential role for blue foods in sustainable diets. And by this, I mean the opportunities for improving nutrition while reducing environmental pressures. There's been increasing attention toward the potential role of blue food in sustainable diets from both the health and the environment side. On the health side, blue foods are promising because they can improve health by reducing micronutrient deficiencies. This is because a lot of aquatic foods are dense in micronutrients and have a high density of bioavailable micronutrients. They're also a very important source of essential fatty acids, and they can play a role in displacing less healthy animal-sourced foods, thereby reducing some of the non-communicable disease risk within populations. On the environmental side, there are a few ways in which blue foods are really promising for reducing some environmental pressures. And this is because capture fisheries use trivial land and water resources and result in very few nutrient emissions. So they primarily contribute to greenhouse gas emissions of these major categories of environmental pressures. When you look at farmed species, there are a number of unfed farmed species which require very few resource inputs, and many of the species which are farmed have low feed conversion ratios compared to their terrestrial counterparts, which reduces the overall resource use required for some of those species. So this positions blue foods for being really promising in creating more sustainable diets. However, many studies looking at sustainable diets don't include blue foods at all. And when they are, they're usually presented as one or just a couple groups. This is actually a pretty big problem because looking across all of the different aquatic foods, there's over 2,500 species or species groups which are caught and farmed across marine, inland, and brackish habitats. So when we look across this vast diversity, we can imagine that they are going to differ greatly potentially in both their nutrient content and their environmental pressures. So whenever we are lumping all of these together as a single group, it's really masking that vast diversity and thereby limiting our understanding of the potential role for blue foods in more sustainable diets. So this was a big focus of the blue food assessment, was really starting to look at the more nuanced potential role of blue foods across many dimensions, two of which being the environment and nutrition. So in a paper led by Chris Golden, as part of this assessment, he looked at, and the team compiled nutrient composition data from across aquatic and terrestrial animal source foods. And in this figure, you can see the summary of nutrient density, where darker colors are higher nutrient density and lower are less, or lighter are lower concentrations of those nutrients. And looking across all of these species, we find that many blue foods outrank livestock, though there are, of course, some differences when you look at particular micronutrients. So in this figure, you have them ranked in terms of their overall micronutrient density and colored for the blue foods, and then green for terrestrial. So you see many of these blue foods popping up here at the top. This really points to that need to disaggregate the blue food consumption data by species, or at least species group, as they do differ in terms of their nutrient contents. So we have a similar issue on the environmental side. Previous work on life cycle assessments to understand some of the environmental pressures stemming from blue food production represented relatively few blue food species or species groups, and tend to have very few environmental pressures covered. So this work is part of a review that I was involved in, and the darker, or the colors that move toward yellow, represent more studies that have that data point. And you have which environmental pressure on the y-axis here, and then all of these different foods along the x-axis, with these ones highlighted as the aquatic foods. And what you can see is that there are really just a few studies across most environmental pressures, with slightly more within the greenhouse gas emissions. But overall, there's a pretty big lack of information in the environmental pressures for these different aquatic foods. And so what we really wanted to do as part of the blue food assessment was improve our estimates of some key food system environmental pressures. So the food system overall emits around a third of all greenhouse gas emissions, uses over half of the ice-free land, and emits around 3/4 of the nitrogen emissions and freshwater use. And so we first mapped out all of the different kinds of environmental pressures one could think about when it comes to aquaculture and capture production. You can see here on the left in the green, the aquaculture pressures tend to look more similar to the types of pressures you see for farming, whereas, of course, the capture fishery pressures include some overlap with what you see with farming, including greenhouse gas emissions, but it also has many kinds of pressures which are not fully comparable or represented for the terrestrial systems, especially related to bycatch and food web alterations. So a key caveat to the findings that I'm about to show related to environmental performance is that this is not looking at any of the ecological impacts. It's really focused on these big pressures that are common across food production systems. So in order to improve our estimates of those specific resource use and emission environmental pressures, we first developed a simplified environmental impact model, and based on the literature of which factors were really important at generating emissions or with using land or water resources. We then completed or compiled life cycle analysis studies focused on commercial production level studies. So we really excluded the experimental farms, which aren't representative of what's currently going on in the industry. We then extracted the underlying data from the previous studies. And this is actually really key because it allows us to create comparable estimates for the emissions and resource use. And then finally, we input that underlying data into our models to generate these standardized estimates of environmental stressors within a hierarchical Bayesian model. The data that we compiled covered over 1,500 farms and more than 1,000 fishery records. We had production data from 29 aquaculture producing nations, and our estimates represent 23 species groups that make up around 70% of all blue food production. And so while we had pretty good coverage, one thing that I will say is that there are still certainly gaps in the data and its representativeness within the literature. And that creates some bigger levels of uncertainty on some of the results that you're about to see here on the next slide. So this is absolutely a priority area for improving our understanding and improving the data collection of environmental performance and some of the practices on farms into the future. But using all of this data and bringing it together in our model, we're able to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions here in blue for both farmed and wild fisheries, then the nitrogen and phosphorus emissions for aquaculture, as well as the water use and land use for aquaculture. Looking across these, a key thing that you can see is that the capture fisheries span from the highest to among the lowest greenhouse gas emissions. So they really go the full range, underscoring the importance of really breaking down wild capture by its at least species group and gear type in order to understand its greenhouse gas emissions. And then in addition to that, we estimated the greenhouse gas emissions or all of the environmental pressures associated with the range of pressures for industrial chicken production. And that's represented by these tan bands. So you'll see here that for capture fisheries, many of the species perform right around or have significant overlap with the chicken range, with some outperforming chicken. Looking then across the farm species, the lowest across all environmental pressures is unsurprisingly the unfed aquaculture, which would be the bivalves and the seaweeds. They don't require those feed inputs, so they really have pretty negligible impacts on land and water, as well as they take out nitrogen and phosphorus from the water column. So they actually have a negative emission on that front. So they perform the best, but there are some fed species which do perform relatively well. We have the carps performing really well on greenhouse gas emissions and nitrogen and phosphorus. And then on the land and waterfront, salmon and trout tend to perform the best. But looking across it, there are quite a few species that across measures are outperforming the chicken profile. We can see that a little bit more clearly here when we bring together the nutrient data and the environmental data for aquaculture. And these are now ranked by an aggregate index of their environmental and nutrient performance. And you can see that nearly every group outperforms chicken, with chicken having a pretty similar profile to the tilapias overall. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the bivalves and those carps come up here on the top when looking at the nutrient side and the environment side together. A really key thing from all of this, though, is that when we want to look at the performance of these species, there really is quite a bit of range, and we do have to break seafood down into not only whether it's farmed or wild, but also start to get information about these different species groups if we want to understand the nutrient and environmental performance of these of blue foods overall. So then, as I promised, this talk is really going to focus on trade. And if you want to understand consumption patterns, you really have to understand trade. You need to know what's coming into a country and what's going out of that country to get a good idea about what is being consumed. The problem is that most of the work on trade so far has been focused on either trade in the aggregate or in really broad groups, or it just looks at these categories of products and product trade. And I'll get to why that's an issue here in a second. The reason that trade has primarily been focused in these really broad groups is because there's a fundamental mismatch between the global production and the global trade data. Global production data gets reported in terms of species or species group as the live weight equivalent. Trade, however, gets reported in terms of commodities, so things like whole frozen salmon or canned salmon, and it gets reported as product weight. In addition to that, products are traded and they'll be imported, processed, and then re-exported again, creating these longer supply chains that can be difficult to disentangle. So you wind up with this problem where you have one species going into multiple commodities and any one commodity being made up of multiple species. This many-to-many matching problem means that we often have to just aggregate everything up in order to get a complete picture. But the result of that is that we actually have only a really basic understanding of some of the most basic characteristics of our global seafood trade system. It's really difficult to distinguish whether traded products are farmed or wild. It's difficult to identify whether or not what was traded came from domestic production or if it was something that was imported and re-exported. And these two things then make it really difficult to link our trade data back to environmental change or to analyze the impacts of policy changes on the overall food system. So in order to address this problem and this fundamental data gap, I've been leading the effort of the development of the Aquatic Resource Trade and Species Database. This is going to be a publicly available database estimating species or species group trade flows going back to 1996, expressed as both live weight equivalent and in terms of the nutrient content. This work is funded by the National Science Foundation, the Environmental Defense Fund, Oceana, and Seafood Watch. You can check out our website if you'd like to receive updates about the release of this data in the future or other activities around the database itself. So estimating the database has been a very long journey. And so this is going to be a very brief overview of how we estimate the species level trade flows. But I'd be happy to answer any more detailed questions at the end about it. In broad overview, though, the disaggregation of global trade data happens in two main steps. The first is essentially solving a mass balance problem for each country and for each year. And what that mass balance problem is aiming to do is to estimate the species mix in each exported product while accounting for processing and products that are arising from unknown origin. The second piece is to then convert the network into this disaggregated species level by connecting those species mixes and their form processing back to the bilateral trade data. So we'll go over that here in a little bit more detail. In that first step, we set up a problem for each country that looks roughly like this, where in some way the production and imports have to equal the exports and consumption, with consumption staying positive. The production of domestic products can come from the landings of species or production from aquaculture and their conversion into these processed products. So we identified all of the different commodities that each species can go into, along with their processing losses. We then also define which products each imported product could be converted into. So of course you could have a whole frozen salmon converted into a canned salmon, but you can't have vice versa. And you also cannot have that salmon turn into a shrimp, for example. And so with all of those definitions, what we're really trying to estimate here is the proportion of production going into each product of domestic products. So that gives us our species mix within each domestically exported product. And then the conversion from one product to another product. In addition to that, there are instances where exports cannot be explained by imports and production alone. And that's where we get this error term here, which we'll call unknown source. In addition to that, we estimate the consumption. And so once we have those pieces, we're able to connect it back to the bilateral trade data, first by estimating the range of export sources. So how much of the exports were coming from domestic versus what was imported and processed again, or re-exported versus error. We get that range, and then we take the domestic share and connect it back to that exporting country's species mix. And for the parts that are re-exported, we track them back through the bilateral trade network, through their product conversions, and link them back to their source country's species mix. That allows us to then get our best estimate of the species or species group flows through the products to the final consuming country. We then do one thing to improve the resolution a bit better. As many of you probably know, global trade data, a lot of it gets reported in terms of marine species NEI. We can actually compare our estimated species name to the best resolution of the code. So if you have that marine species NEI going into, say, a tuna code, we can actually rename it to the taxonomic group for that code. That then gives us a species level trade database. We retain the information about whether things are marine or inland and farmed versus wild. So taking that data, I can show you a few of the big overarching trade patterns that we are seeing with our new database. So most of these figures are going to refer to the trade in the broad groups of marine capture, marine aquaculture, inland capture, and inland aquaculture, with a little bit of the species resolution shown, but it becomes too much to go into too much detail about the specific species patterns. But even just at this really broad level, here are some of the new insights that we get from this database. So blue food trade has more than doubled since 1996, and the majority of that growth has come from aquaculture. So capture fishery trade increased by around 80%. It still has been increasing, but aquaculture trade more than tripled over this period. Capture fisheries products are still making up the majority of global exports, but the share comprised from aquaculture has risen to almost a third of all blue food exports. You'll see here that there's a little dip in 2020 where exports declined about 4% in 2020 compared to 2019, of course, likely due to COVID. But one thing that's really enlightening from this particular database is that we can distinguish that the decline came from the capture fisheries, whereas aquaculture exports actually increased in 2020 compared to 2019. This really highlights some of the differences in the impacts felt across the sectors from COVID, and also the importance of disaggregating the trade data. So here's a little bit about some of the species level or species group level trade trends that we can see by group. One thing that's key is that the top traded species groups varies greatly across these different production sources. You can see a few of those here. Note that the grouping here of other is disaggregated into species. It's just for presentation's sake. Anything below a certain percent threshold gets grouped into other. The marine aquaculture trade is really concentrated among just a few species. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Atlantic salmon here is really the top group, driving a lot of the trends for marine aquaculture. And then if we look over to inland capture, you can see that a lot of that trade is resolved only to these broad groups. And that's to go back to this fact that the production data is really driving the disaggregation, and a lot of the inland capture data is not resolved to a very fine taxonomic resolution. And so consequently, we only get a fairly broad taxonomic resolution for inland capture. This is, of course, also an issue for some of the trade codes. Many of the inland trade codes are also not very highly resolved to species. Another thing that we're seeing is that by having this trade data connected to the source country, we can look at the share of production that's exported, while excluding what was coming from foreign sources. This allows us to see that now a third of marine capture fishery production is exported, and that's compared to only 7% of inland aquaculture production that's exported. So this is really a huge range in terms of how foreign versus domestically oriented these different sectors are. In addition to that, we can really compare this to the share of cereals production that are exported, which grew from around 10% in the 1990s to around 17% in the 2020s. Cereals are often considered very highly globalized, and you can see here that both the marine capture and marine aquaculture production exceed this level of export destination for production. So then if we start to think about the potential for this increasing trade and increasing share that's exported for resilience of these food systems, trade really cuts both ways when it comes to resilience. It can allow access to these foreign products and foreign goods during times of local shortages, but it also creates a potential risk of exposure from propagated shocks. So a range of simple network models have found that net importers, developing countries, and countries with low food stocks tend to be the most exposed to these foreign shocks, and that some of the ways to reduce risk are to increase production diversity and not to rely on a single exporter too much, and to maintain these local buffers. This issue, there's not a ton of empirical evidence, so this is really a priority area going forward. A lot of these findings are based on some of the structural features of networks. So I'm going to connect some of these findings to some of the structures that we're seeing across the blue food sector here. So the first piece is that blue food trade overall is highly connected, and the overall connectivity has increased over time. Marine trade networks are the most highly connected. They have an average of 40 partners per exporter. But over this time period, all 4 networks have increased by an additional 10 partners, 10 export partners. So it's becoming more highly connected. At the same time, it's becoming less concentrated. So the export concentration has remained roughly the same, with around 18 countries making up 75% of exports in 1996, compared to 21 in 2019. The imports have become noticeably less concentrated, though, with only 12 countries making up 75% of imports in 96 compared to 21 here in 2019. And that really reflects the growing demand and growing middle class in a lot of countries which are having these rising fast incomes and growing populations. When we compare this concentration, though, to crops, we see that 7 countries in the EU make up 90% of wheat exports, and only 4 countries made up 80% of corn exports. So the cereals really are much more highly concentrated than what we're seeing in the blue food system. Then when it comes to net imports, Europe and North America are the highest net importers. And this has increased, especially for North America. South America is the highest net exporter, and overall, the least developed countries collectively are net exporters across all of these different production methods, and those net exports have almost tripled over this time period. Now, being a net exporter rather than a net importer might be a good thing in terms of resilience, but there are potential issues with this trade pattern that are pretty concerning around the potential for the diversion of these nutrient-rich foods away from some of the people who might benefit from them the most. But looking at it from a resilience perspective, this decreasing concentration is probably a good thing for food system resilience, and as it allows for this larger response space in the case of a potential shock. But for the countries where there's an increasing reliance on imports, it can potentially pose a risk from a resilience standpoint. But the information just from a structural standpoint on the increased volume and connectivity for trade is a little bit less clear about the trade-off there and whether or not it's improving or degrading the overall resilience within the food system. So then the patterns that we've been looking at so far have been in aggregate across these sectors, but we do have the bilateral trade flow information. So we can look now at some of the shifts in regional flows. So just looking at a really high level here, comparing these four sector groups, we can see that there are noticeable differences across these sectors. Asia dominates the inland capture and aquaculture trade, both as an importer and exporter, whereas Europe is a really strong player for marine trade. The key point at just this high level is that there are these big differences in the structural flows across these subsectors. Looking at it then over time, you can see that we have the exporting region here on the y-axis and the importing region along the x-axis. And along the diagonal, you have trade within a region. And you can see these strengthening ties within Africa, Asia, and Europe. This is what trade models tend to expect, is that countries that are within a region would have stronger trade ties, though some models expect that the decreasing transportation costs and increasing integration across regions would weaken that pattern. We do see this really high increase in trade, though, within region for these three regions. Conversely, though, North and South America and Oceania have the highest trade with Asia, and for Oceania and South America especially, that trade pattern has been strengthening. Overall, though, across these pairs, nearly all region pairs increased their trade, with the notable exception of trade within North America. And at the country level, 2/3 of all country pairs increased their blue food trade. So having these trade flows and being able to trace trade back to its origin country allows us to be able to look at patterns of blue food consumption and where that consumption is sourced. So when I talk about consumption here, I'm talking about apparent consumption, which represents the production and imports minus exports. This is expressed as live weight equivalent, so it's not looking at just the edible portion, and it's not accounting for waste. Overall, blue food consumption increased during this time period, but that's really been driven by increases in aquaculture consumption. You can see here in the dark blue line at the top that marine capture consumption has declined, whereas the inland consumption in the light orange has risen rapidly. Consumption increased in all regions except North and South America, where it's been fairly stable in North America and slightly declining within South America. The greatest aquaculture increases are occurring here, of course, within Asia, unsurprisingly, but there were significant increases from a proportional standpoint in North America, Europe, and Oceania. So we can see that that's really driving some of this aquaculture increase, and that there's pretty big differences in terms of the consumption patterns across these regions, with even greater differences at the country level. Looking at it by source, globally, the share of supply from domestic sources remain approximately stable. This is one particular point that actually we're improving the model on. And so this piece might change a little bit here, but a lot of the broad patterns will stay the same. We see really high regional variation where Asia and South America are dominated by domestic supply in the orange line, whereas Europe has a majority sourced from foreign supply. North America and the US winds up with consumption around 50%, US verging on 60% coming from foreign sources. And this can be really important, mostly or in part politically. Here in the US, this has come up pretty regularly. Many people will quote the statistic that 90% of seafood consumed in the US is imported. This, in fact, showed up on the agenda of the former Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, who was pointing out that this was a priority to change our trade deficit into a trade surplus. And within some of the strategic priorities coming out of NOAA during that time, they were identifying potential ways to reduce that seafood deficit, including increasing aquaculture production in the US and opening the marine monuments to commercial fishing. The increase in aquaculture has remained a priority within the US, partly framed as this idea of needing to reduce reliance on foreign imports. So when I was working on all of this trade data, I couldn't find where this 90% number was coming from. So we did a deep dive into the US statistics and actually found, with a separate approach, a foreign dependence of around 63%. The largest difference in our estimate versus what these NOAA numbers that were circulating were coming from is from just this sort of statistical assumption underlying all of these comparisons, which are the live weight conversion factors. And so really, this plays an important role and serves as an important source of uncertainty in any of these calculations of consumption. So having this information at the species level allows us to start to look at the diversity of what's consumed in country and compare that to the diversity of what's being imported. This question is really motivated by the idea that trade may be driving this homogenization of consumption around the world. So what we see is a pretty big scatter across the countries, but here we have the diversity of the domestic portion of supply for each country compared to the diversity of the foreign portion of the supply for each region. And what we see across this is that the domestic source consumption diversity tends to be higher than the diversity of foreign sourced goods. And so what that's really suggesting is that currently the domestic production diversity is really playing an important role in the overall diversity of what's being consumed within countries. Nevertheless, the diversity of the overall supply is positively associated with total imports. So what this suggests is that the imported products are adding to the overall diversity of supply within these countries. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't still be concerned about the potential homogenization through displacing local production by these imports that are competing with local goods. But it is to say that currently it doesn't look like we're seeing that across the board. And we can potentially use imports as a way to boost overall supply diversity, but there's absolutely a need to still protect that domestic supply diversity. So overall, we've seen that blue food trade has increased in terms of volume, connectivity, and the share exported in levels that are similar to or exceeding agriculture. We also see that global blue food consumption increased, but that's driven primarily by aquaculture. There are also quite a few countries that are increasingly dependent on these foreign sourced blue foods, but the degree varies greatly around the world. Finally, trade can add to the overall consumption diversity, but it's really important for it not to displace that domestic production diversity. So with this first version of the database ready, we have many different projects and analyses and applications of this data that we're currently working on. One thing that I'm really excited about is that many students are working on contributing case studies to a case study database that will be featured on the website to highlight different applications of the database. So some of these include analysis of coral bleaching impacts on aquarium trade, comparing farmed versus wild salmon trade, looking at fish meal trade out of West Africa, looking at the impacts of aquaculture diseases on exports, and looking at the effects of the annexation of Crimea on trade with and by Russia. And so on that last one, that one's out of order here. On that last one, a student was looking at the Russian seafood, on imports of Russian seafood based on whether or not they impose sanctions on Russia following the annexation of Crimea. And what you can see here in this first figure is that the countries that did not impose sanctions increased their imports of Russian-sourced seafood fairly rapidly following the annexation of Crimea. Whereas for those that did impose a sanction, there was a slight decrease in the overall imports of Russian seafood, but it remained fairly stable over that period of time. On the flip side, this is looking at seafood that was exported to Russia, whether or not they imposed a sanction. So for those countries which did not impose a sanction on Russia, they increased their exports of seafood to Russia, whereas those that did, almost all of them had a precipitous drop in the seafood that they were exporting to Russia. And so what this really says overall is that those that imposed sanctions on Russia essentially stopped having their seafood bought by Russia, whereas they still largely continued buying Russian seafood, is what we're seeing so far. Taking this then to the current situation in Ukraine, the US has put sanctions on purchasing of Russian seafood goods. And we can look we can look at the most recent data. So looking in 2019 to 2020, we can see where Russian sourced seafood comes from into the United States. And as you can see here, the majority of Russian seafood that goes to the US is flowing through China, not coming directly through Russia. A fair share also comes through Canada. So this really poses a challenge for monitoring and enforcing these restrictions on Russian imported seafood. And so we can also look at which species those tend to likely affect. And you can see here that the vast majority of what the US was importing of Russian source through that channel is the Alaska pollock. And so many of these different case studies are really just very preliminary results and are going to be sort of updated and finalized and then included within the website as example applications. We're also preparing documentation and working on the website to make this database publicly available within the next couple of years. The data itself will become available sooner. The ultimate goal of this is for other people to use the data and answer their own questions about blue foods trade and its interaction with the environment and diets. So really hoping for people to stay in touch with us and use this data into the future. So thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for your talk. It's clear that you have invested a lot of work and effort in this database, and so it's most appreciated. Your graph of the trade trends, especially regionally, draw my attention a lot. It's I'm from Brazil, so for me, it's a clear example of the colonialism that we still have in the global South that we face every day, right? You have, at least in South Africa and Brazil, in South America and Brazil, where I'm from, most of our production is to satisfy an overconsumption of global North, right? And that is exactly what you're seeing in your database. And then we're often being scrutinized as a constant growing population, et cetera, when the consumption comes in the global North. So the question is, are you and your team looking for these narratives in the database? Have you looking at that? I think it would be a super interesting, unique piece.
Yeah, so not currently specifically. We're looking at that a fair bit more specifically in West Africa when it comes to some of the pelagic fisheries and the consumption of those by the global North and through aquaculture. We have not done as much yet on anything about the colonial legacies and the ties within this work, though more broadly in a project of NCEAS, we are including that to understand some of the trade flows and the externalization of environmental pressures. But I think it would be really fascinating. One other thing with the South America case is that, well, two notes. One is that all of this really is just blue food. A lot of people ask if some of those trends are related to Peruvian anchoveta. They're not. We exclude the non-human uses here. The second thing is that there also is a decline in the overall catch within the region, and that feeds into this overall trend in the decline in capture, but also some of the trade patterns. But yeah, you see a lot of that trade headed out of South America. So it's one of the cases where you don't see the highest trade as being within region, but out of the region. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you see the same on land, right? We see the same crops and mining. It's all for exportation or for like production and consumption. So it's even in that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So Jessica, I have a question for you. You can basically track which country is catching what, and you plotted the foreign versus the domestic. We know that since a couple of decades, the ocean is warming and the species are on the move. Did you saw in all the database that you have countries that have lost a part of their population going to the adjacent country and trying to re-import the species that is already on the move?
Yeah, so we haven't seen that yet. We have a current sort of project in mind about trying to detect climate signals within the trade network. One thing that is a challenge is that for detecting some of that is that when you have regional fishing agreements, you can still have the vessels that are catching. Oh, let me back up a second. So the source country in our case is the fishing entity. So they're the ones who report the production data, irrespective of where they caught it. So if you have some kind of fishing agreement where that country may be moving further north, but they have a fishing agreement, it would still show up in their production data as domestic. So there are a few challenges to picking that up, but we're really interested in that particular question and how trade may change under some of these scenarios. Yeah, excellent.
Hi, I'll go quick because I see a question from Santiago. And so I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in the early work that you were presenting for your greenhouse gas emission, you were looking at the greenhouse gas emission of like fishing or the actual aquaculture. But then when you were talking about this trade, it's clear that it's like moving around. And I was wondering, how big is that moving around, the transport of the food, contributing to the greenhouse gas emission? And your talk was fabulous. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so you're correct. The emissions that we looked at within the environmental performance paper stop at the farm gate or landing equivalent. So that's not including transport emissions. Across the food sector, the estimate is roughly 10% of the overall product greenhouse gas emissions come from transport. But there's an important caveat within fisheries. There's a fair bit of product that is air freighted, and those have significantly higher emissions. The work to get the full picture on how much of that is not entirely clear. But we have been looking at trade by transport method more recently to start to understand that there's a fair bit that's air freighted of Norwegian salmon to the US, but there's also quite a bit of product that gets traded just when it's fresh or live. Some of that gets air freighted.
Hi, first of all, great talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question, but it's a little bit dealing with the calculations. One thing that you've done is recreate apparent consumption based on imports. But you, at the beginning of your talk, said that sometimes you get data from import product. Does that mean that you have the weight of the can plus the liquid plus the fish, and you are estimating how much fish is in it, and then recreating that into whole fish? So could you explain some of the general rules you've used to reconstruct the live weight equivalent?
Yes, we use the live weight conversion factors from a range of different sources. One big one is from the EU. They have so the UMOFA, they have estimates of live weight conversion factors from the harmonized system product codes back to their live weight equivalent. But we've also pulled data from the FAO and national statistics organizations to get a range of estimates on the live weight conversion factors. So that goes from by combination of species to product code. There are two issues here. So one, we also have to estimate the conversion from one product to another and get the processing losses. And there is a fair bit of uncertainty in that piece as well. So some of these conversion factors range really widely. And this is, for any kind of study, is actually a really big source of uncertainty. Some of them, the wide range is very legitimate because there are differences in processing technologies and the typical size of species when you go from region to region. And so they make a lot of sense. In other cases, they could just be outdated. So in the case of the US live weight conversion factors, some of them had not been updated since I think the 60s, and some were even written in law, interestingly enough, what the conversion factors should be used or applied to some of the Alaska products. And so when they are not updated, they're not taking into account these improvements in technology. So we are, in fact, converting, though, from, yes, the can of tuna back to its live weight equivalent. One other issue that this creates is that we can only track the primary products since we're converting to live weight equivalent. So a lot of people will ask about things like shark fins, but those are considered a co-product. So we just track the primary product to avoid any risk of double counting.
Right. Thank you
Hi,
so
Ibrahim.
much.
Good to see you.
Jessica, thank you so much for the presentation. I appreciate it so much. But I'm wondering, how do you account for unreported trade flows over land? Or there's a lot of unreported cases in Africa. How do you account for that in your database? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so we do not include unreported trade flows. These are disaggregations of reported trade flows only. The extent to which anything is captured that would be unreported is that anytime you're working with trade data, you get mirror trade records to work with. So you can see what I said I sent to you and what you reported that you got from me. So we can see when things go unreported because there's a discrepancy in what we've reported. And so we can work with that to get ranges in the estimated trade. However, in many cases, well, actually, it's not entirely known, but absolutely from just direct observation and from a few case studies, we know that especially in Africa, there's a lot of fish that's moving over land, and like, quite frankly, there's no way either country is reporting this. And so that is just absolutely getting going unreported or undetected. The other thing is that our consumption estimates, since their apparent consumption, will also not be accounting for unreported catch. So they're going to be lower consumption estimates than what you would get if you worked with the sea around us data, for example. So we have run a version of this with the sea around us as well, but those ones are still preliminary.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica.
No more question for you. Thank you, Jessica, for this incredible presentation. And I let Emily for the outro.
Thank you, Jessica. That was super interesting. And I would like to thank Dr. Gephart on behalf of UBC's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries for her presentation.